I would rush home every day so I could watch my favorite soap opera. Yes, I admit it, I became hooked on the storyline and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. See, at heart, I'm a sappy kind of guy, and I like love stories and I love tearjerkers. Not too proud to admit that I do cry at movies with happy endings. You can ask Betty. Today's story is one of those kinds of stories. As we continue our journey through the Bible, we come today to the story of Ruth. I want you to listen today to see how Randy Frazee explains how God's upper story and Ruth's lower story, how they mingle together, and like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. When we enter this story of Ruth, we find the plot line is already in progress. Reading this story almost requires a chart to be able to keep track of the events and all the characters that are in it. We begin during the time of Judges, where we were last week. And we find a married couple from Bethlehem named Naomi and Elimelech. And they move to a region in Moab with their 2 sons. Shortly after their arrival and setting up their new home, the husband, Elimelech, he dies. Eventually, Naomi's 2 sons, they grow up and they marry Moabite women. Their wives' names were Orpah and Ruth. 10 years pass, and the 2 sons, they also die. Are you with me so far? All right. Naomi decides that there really isn't any reason for her to stay here in Moab. The only reason they had moved there in the first place was because of a famine that was occurring back home. Naomi learns that the famine has since passed, and so she packs up her bags and she plans to return to Bethlehem. Her daughter-in-laws are following her, but she stops them and she tells them, "Go ahead, return home to your mothers," and she gives them a kiss goodbye. Now, Naomi must have been a wonderful mother-in-law because the 2 women weep and they beg to go along to Bethlehem with her. Again, Naomi tells them to return home where they have a better chance of finding some nice Moabite men to remarry and settle down with. Orpah reluctantly agrees to remain in Moab, and in a tearful goodbye, she returns back home. Ruth, on the other hand, she remains steady in her conviction not to abandon her mother-in-law, and she gives one of the most beautiful declarations of loyalty that is ever recorded. She tells Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will become my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Now, as powerful as that speech is, there's this underlying factor that makes it even more incredible. Historically, Moab was an enemy of Israel. Although these 2 nations were experiencing a rare time of peace, enemies tend to have long memories. Ruth would have known how risky it was as a Moabite to enter into Bethlehem. This didn't stop her. Neither did the fact that her and Naomi were both widows, and life was going to be very difficult for both of them. Naomi had nothing that she could offer to Ruth, and if she would have chosen to stay in Moab, she would have at least had her extended family to take care of her. But Ruth's pledge to follow Naomi's God is another surprise. Moabites, you see, worshipped the god Chemosh. And the Israelites consider this idolatrous and abominable. Ruth was willing to turn away from the God that she worshiped and turn to the Lord God. Naomi tries to dissuade Ruth from returning with her and warns her that things will be bad because she believed that God had turned against her. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Naomi complains to some of her old friends, saying, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So, Ruth finds herself a widow, living in enemy territory with a woman whose God had apparently abandoned her. This is just the first episode. Looking from our lower story perspective, we find that Naomi and her husband had made a poor decision to settle in a pagan country that had in the past been a bitter enemy to Israel. Her sons, they violated God's teaching that forbid the Israelites to marry outside of their own nation. It made no sense for Ruth to decide to go with her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem now. Now, if you've been paying attention throughout this sermon series, you begin to realize that when things start to get a little fuzzy, God is usually up to something. Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem during the harvest season. It's an opportunity for these two poor widows to earn a little money and to survive on their own. According to God's instructions to the Israelites, farmers were to leave some of the grain for the poor to glean from the fields. They were allowed to follow behind the harvesters and pick up the scraps of grain that were missed. So Ruth decides that she will go out to a field and glean the grain for both of them. This was a very risky and bold move on her part. Bethlehem was a small town where everyone knew everybody, and a stranger would certainly be noticed. A single woman working alone out in the field faces risks. But a foreign woman from an enemy territory would face harassments or worse things. If God was truly up to something, it was going to require Ruth to step out and take some risks. As it turns out, the particular field that Ruth decides to glean from is owned by a relative of her deceased father-in-law. The owner of this field was named Boaz. And when he discovers that Ruth is the Moabite widow who came to Bethlehem with Naomi, he showers her with kindness. He not only allows her to glean as much as she wants, he also allows her to drink from the water jugs that he provides for his workers. He goes on to warn his men, do not bother her. And he instructs them to even leave a little extra grain behind so that she won't have to work so hard. As you can imagine, Ruth is stunned. Foreigners were not treated like this. She rushes home that evening to tell Naomi, who immediately catches sight of God's plan for a happy ending in her life. This is one of those times when the lower story and the upper story seem to fit together beautifully. Naomi takes on the role of matchmaker and instructs Ruth to go and shower and splash a little Chanel No. 5 on and put on your best clothes and go to Boaz's place that evening. But wait until after he has finished eating his dinner. She tells her, after he goes to bed, I want you to sneak in, uncover his feet, and lie down at the foot of his bed. In doing all this, Boaz will understand exactly what Ruth is doing. So Ruth follows her mother-in-law's instructions. Now, these actions aren't as bad as they sound. You see, Ruth's behavior is actually considered a respectful, nonverbal way of conveying her availability and her intent and interest in marriage. When Boaz awakens, he is startled by this stranger camped at the foot of his bed, and he asks who she is. Ruth replies, "I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment to cover me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." In Hebrew, that word garment is the same one used for wing. When Ruth had first met Boaz, he had referred to God's wing providing a place of refuge for her. So now she asks Boaz to become God's wing for her permanently. He accepts, and he exercises his obligation, and they marry. Boaz not only buys Ruth's deceased husband's land, he also buys his brother's land and Elimelech's land also. By risking his own estate, he redeems all of them together. So you might ask, what motivated Boaz to turn his attention from his own needs and his own wants to reach out to this outsider? Well, Boaz knew what it was like to be an outsider. If we turn to Matthew chapter 1, we discover that Boaz's mother was Rahab. If you remember, Rahab was the Canaanite prostitute who hid the Israelite spies in Jericho. She had risked her life to save these strangers. And as a result, she was adopted into the family of Israel. Boaz has it in his heart to reach out to someone else who stands on the outside looking in, who in this case is Ruth. After Ruth and Boaz are married, they have a son. And this son inherits the land of Mahlon, who was Naomi's son and Ruth's deceased husband. Now the son is able to carry on the family name because of the kindness of Boaz. In her lower story, Naomi thought that her life was over and that God had given up on her, but she was mistaken. Her grandson was now living proof that God never abandoned her. This boy was named Obed, which means worker. Naomi had been forced to sell off all this land because she was unable to work it. So now God had provided the workers that she needed to tend to her lower story ground. Now, as overwhelming as all these twists and turns in the plot sound, the good news doesn't stop there. There's more going on in God's upper story. If we turn ahead to the book of Ruth, to the end, we find the genealogy of Boaz's family. Their son, Obed, he grew up, he had a son, and he named his son Jesse. And Jesse, he grew up, and he had a son, and he named him David, as in King David. 28 generations later, a child is born in a stable in Bethlehem and was named Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate guardian redeemer. He will redeem all who want his wing of forgiveness to cover them, even the outsiders. Jesus was born into a family of outsiders descended from Ruth. God had been working above the scenes of Ruth and Naomi's lives in their lower story to provide them a son who could redeem the land for them. God was also working in their lives to ultimately provide the son who could redeem the world. God went out of his way to include an outsider, a pagan Moabite, into the lineage of Jesus. He gives us a reminder that his salvation is for all people. In this lower story, life seemed hopeless with no chance of acceptance for outsiders. In the upper story, God redeemed their lives and accepted them as his own. And he continued to carry out his plan for bridging the gap between God and his children. As we examine these stories, we see more and more evidence of the coming Messiah, who will offer himself as a sacrifice for the reconciliation with God for us. Today, you might find yourself feeling like your story seems hopeless. It might feel like you're living a modern-day soap opera with crisis after crisis and turmoil in relationships. If so, remember Romans 8:28. There it says, if we love God and we align our lives to his purpose, God is working everything out for our good, just as he did for Naomi and for Ruth. And since we already know how the story ultimately ends, we can wait patiently for God to unfold his good plan